UK billionaire Jim Ratcliffe recently complained that London streets were unsafe because the government had not invested enough in justice and police, and in recent years the level of knife crime has risen significantly. And it is true that the police and justice system is severely underfunded, overcrowded, with a backlog of cases, and there's a danger it could get worse in the next few years because the funding isn't there. But is it really true that we can't afford to pay for better public services? Despite relatively stagnant incomes, wealth has increased significantly in the past 15 years. Global wealth has increased from 3 trillion to over 12 trillion in 2022. In the UK alone, since the start of COVID, the number of billionaires has increased by 20%. But many of those millionaires are paying lower effective tax rates than you might imagine. 10% of millionaires pay an effective tax rate of 11%. We'll explain why this is later. But that's a lower tax rate than somebody earning £15,000. But the bigger issue is not low tax rates, but tax avoidance. 4 years ago, Jim Ratcliffe announced he was moving to Monaco to save an estimated £4 billion in tax. No wonder he can afford to invest in a struggling football club. Now, it wasn't always like this. After the Second World War, the sense of national crisis engendered a sense of unity and a sense of we're all in this together. The government had a very progressive tax system. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the top rate of income tax was around 90%. There was a purchase tax limited to just luxury items. But far from crushing the economy, it actually coincided with one of the fastest rates of growth the UK has ever seen in the post-war economic boom. And this was a growth which was broad-based. Everybody benefited. In fact, income inequality declined in that period, as you might imagine. Even more dramatic was the decline in wealth inequality. Wealth owned by the top 1% fell very significantly. And it wasn't just about high inheritance tax, there were also social issues such as the decline in the aristocratic class. But the interesting thing is that this very progressive tax system was in vogue across the Western world. Even America and Europe, they all had very high progressive tax systems, and it all led to better growth for everybody. But by the 1970s, the growth of global airline travel started the growth of a new phenomenon, the tax haven. Small countries and principalities suddenly started to see huge influxes of money as wealthy citizens sought to escape high tax rates back home. The likes of Bermuda, Monaco, the Cayman Islands, countries like Liechtenstein and Luxembourg could all gain very high revenue by charging very low tax rates or even none at all. The IMF estimate that tax havens cost global governments around $500 billion a year from corporation tax avoidance alone. For example, let's take the case of Amazon. Now, they have their main subsidiary in Luxembourg. It handles the sales to the UK and 6 major other countries. In 2020, it shifted over £8 billion of UK sales to Luxembourg, and it has an impressive sales of $8 million per employee. But in 2020, despite a COVID surge in income to €44 billion, it ended up paying no corporation tax that year. Now, it does pay VAT, but even so, that's a big loss of corporate tax revenue. And it's not just companies, of course. Individuals have also made use of tax havens. The total amount saved abroad in tax havens is estimated between $8 and $36 trillion, and that easily leads to the loss of around 200 billion income tax revenues per year. Now, the existence of global tax havens partly explains the ever-increasing global tax competition we see between different countries. This has seen average corporation tax rates decline steadily in the past few decades. Now, free market think tanks like to say that you should cut corporation tax to attract investment from elsewhere. But of course, if everybody does it, there's no actual advantage. Lower tax rates, it's mainly companies who benefit. And of course, companies are in a position to say, if you don't cut corporate tax rates, we'll move elsewhere. But what is desperately needed is not a beggar thy neighbour policy of trying to undercut other countries, but a global cooperation on a minimum tax rate. For example, there's a hope that a UN tax convention could play a role in preventing tax abuses. Without it, the UN claim, we could lose around $4.8 trillion in the coming decade. The OECD have proposed a minimum corporation tax rate of 15%. Now, it's another good starting point, but currently has so many loopholes, it will raise less tax revenue than hoped. But going back to the UK, how come that some of the rich pay lower effective tax rates than an average worker? For example, if we take Rishi Sunak, the last Prime Minister, he had an effective tax rate of 23% on income of £2.2 million. Now, this is because his income comes from different sources: a salary, US investment income, and capital gains. Now, income from a job is taxed at 47%. Dividends from a personal service company are taxed at 38%. But if you are receiving money in the form of capital gains, it is taxed at either 10 or 20%. In other words, the rate of tax that you pay depends on how you receive income. And it tends to be that the wealthier that you are, the more capital gains you get, and therefore the lower the effective tax rate. But the important thing is, the effective tax rate can be significantly less than the headline rate we see. Having said that, it is worth bearing in mind that the top 1% of income tax payers pay a record 30% of all income tax in the UK. This is the highest rate for 20 years, a reflection of faster income growth amongst the top 1%. But it does mean that 30% of government income tax revenue is paid for by just 300,000 individuals. And this is why the government always has this fear that these individuals will go and work somewhere else. It's a big gap to fill. However, employment income is only one source of revenue for the wealthy. An LSE study suggests that a flat 35% rate on taxable income and gains could raise an additional £11 billion per year. If each of the 5 wealthiest people in the world spent $1 million a day, it would take them 476 years to exhaust their combined wealth. So another source of tax revenue that the UK is currently reluctant to use is a wealth tax. Now, as an LSE study that found a one-off wealth tax on millionaire couples at 1% a year for 5 years could raise £260 billion over 5 years. Now, Jim Ratcliffe may have saved $4 billion on tax by moving to Monaco, so he is privately rich. But also the irony is, when he goes to London, he feels publicly poor. And this is the tragedy of offshore tax havens. $4 trillion sitting on offshore accounts, whilst social problems, global warming and other issues get worse. The real question becomes whether you can tax wealth without losing it to tax avoidance. Will millionaires flee to the Bahamas and Monaco? Now, if an American wanted to live in Monaco as a tax exile, they would have to relinquish American citizenship, a step few are willing to take. The UK is different because you can become a tax exile, but retain UK citizenship. Also, another good question to ask is that does a high tax burden reduce the quality of life and damage the economy? Imagine a country with free education, healthcare, university fees, and the second highest reported levels of happiness in the world, and the greatest degree of social mobility. It happens to have one of the highest tax rates in the world. This video looks at why Denmark is so rich and what role tax plays in it. It's a great video, so please do check it out.